Maybe we should go back to being friends, she suggested when her ex started calling again, so I quietly stepped back, joined a new social circle, and met someone amazing. Now she's single and scrolling through my vacation photos while I build a life with my new girlfriend who never doubted us. Hey folks, before we jump into the video, please consider subscribing and giving a thumbs up if you like seeing karma work faster than expected. Thank you. Let's dive in. I'm a high school history teacher in Phoenix, and for 8 months I'd been dating Tessa, a graphic designer who seemed to appreciate my steady nature and dry sense of humor about teenage drama. We had this comfortable rhythm, weekend hikes, quiet dinners where we actually talked, the kind of relationship that felt like it was building toward something real. Then Travis happened. Her ex-boyfriend, a personal trainer with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing people pay you to look at your abs, started calling and texting after his latest rebound relationship crashed and burned. At first, Tessa seemed genuinely annoyed by his persistence, rolling her eyes when his name popped up on her phone during our dinner at that little Italian place downtown. He just can't accept that it's over, she said, declining his call for the 3rd time that evening. I appreciated her transparency. She was telling me about the calls instead of hiding them, which felt like the mature thing to do. But then subtle changes started creeping in. Tessa began taking longer to respond to my texts, sometimes hours when she used to reply within minutes. During our dinner dates, she'd get this distant look in her eyes, like she was having conversations in her head that didn't include me. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I was at her apartment complex helping her assemble a bookshelf. Around 7, Travis showed up in the parking lot, looking like he'd come straight from the gym. Tessa's face went pale when she saw him through the window. I need to go handle this quickly, she said, grabbing her keys. Just tell him to leave you alone, I suggested, but she was already heading for the door. It'll just take a minute. I stayed upstairs, continuing to work on the bookshelf while trying not to watch the scene unfolding below. But as the minutes ticked by, 5, then 15, then 30, I found myself stealing glances out the window. Their body language told the entire story. What started as Tessa standing with her arms crossed gradually evolved into something more intimate. She stepped closer, her posture softened, and I could see her laughing at something he said. When an hour had passed and they were still talking, leaning against his truck like they were catching up after a brief separation, I realized what I was actually witnessing. Tessa wasn't handling Travis, she was reconnecting with him. I finished assembling the bookshelf in silence, each piece clicking into place while my 8-month relationship quietly fell apart 3 stories below. When she finally came back upstairs, her cheeks were flushed and she avoided direct eye contact. Sorry that took so long, she said, but her voice carried a breathlessness that hadn't been there when she left. He's just going through a really hard time right now. The bookshelf stood completed between us, ready to hold whatever future we thought we were building together, but I could see in her eyes that she was already somewhere else entirely. The following weekend, we drove to Sedona for what was supposed to be a romantic hiking trip to Cathedral Rock. I'd booked us a cabin with a view of the Red Rocks, the kind of place where couples usually make plans for their future together. Instead, Tessa spent most of the 2-hour drive staring out the passenger window, responding to my attempts at conversation with half-hearted nods and distracted hms. When we reached the trailhead, she was unusually quiet, not pointing out the stunning rock formations or making her usual commentary about other hikers' questionable footwear choices. About halfway up the trail, she stopped walking entirely and sat down on a large boulder overlooking the valley. Cole, I need to talk to you about something, she said, her voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're about to detonate your life. I sat down beside her, already knowing this wasn't going to be a conversation about our hiking pace. Travis showing up the other night really threw me off, she continued, picking at a loose thread on her hiking shorts. I thought I was completely over him, but seeing him again brought up all these confusing feelings I wasn't expecting. The honesty was brutal but somehow appreciated. At least she wasn't trying to gaslight me into thinking that hour-long parking lot conversation was nothing. What kind of feelings? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. I don't know exactly. Just, we have so much history together, and when he talked about how much he's changed, how he realizes what he lost. She trailed off, staring at the red rocks like they might provide the words she was looking for. I think maybe we should go back to being friends for a while, she finally said. Just until I can sort out what I'm actually feeling. I don't want to hurt you while I'm emotionally unavailable like this. There was the classic let's be friends speech, delivered with the kind of gentle cruelty that's supposed to make the recipient feel grateful for being dumped so considerately. I could have argued, could have pointed out that 8 months of building something real should count for more than a few weeks of nostalgia-fueled confusion. Instead, I nodded calmly and said, "If that's what you need, then okay." Her eyebrows flickered with surprise, like she'd expected me to fight harder or beg her to reconsider. "You're really okay with this?" she asked, searching my face for signs of the devastation I was carefully keeping locked away. "I can't force someone to choose me, Tessa. If you need space to figure things out, I respect that." The drive back to Phoenix was 2 hours of awkward silence punctuated by forced small talk about the scenery and her playlist choices. She kept glancing at me like she was waiting for me to break down or demand explanations, but I just focused on the highway ahead and tried not to think about the cabin reservation I'd have to cancel or the weekend I'd planned around making memories with someone who was already mentally packing her bags. That evening, after dropping her off at her apartment with a polite hug and a "take care of yourself," I drove past Travis's gym on my way home. Her car was in the parking lot, confirming what I'd already suspected. The friends' conversation hadn't been about needing space to think. It had been about clearing her schedule to see where things went with her ex. She'd just been too considerate to admit she'd already made her choice before we ever sat down on that boulder in Sedona. Instead of wallowing or launching some desperate campaign to win Tessa back, I made a decision that surprised even me. I quietly removed myself from the entire situation. Not dramatically, not with angry proclamations or social media posts about moving on, just a calm, methodical withdrawal from all the spaces where our lives intersected. When our mutual friends invited me to Dave's birthday party at that sports bar downtown where Tessa would obviously be, I politely declined and spent the evening grading papers and planning next week's lesson on the Civil War. When Sarah texted about the group hiking trip to South Mountain, I suddenly had a family commitment that weekend. I wasn't lying exactly. I was committing to taking care of my own family, which was just me. The approach felt natural, like a teacher managing a disruptive classroom situation by removing the source of distraction rather than escalating the conflict. Tessa sent a few tentative texts over the first couple weeks, casual messages asking how I was doing and suggesting we grab coffee, as friends, to make sure there were no hard feelings between us. I responded with brief, polite messages that acknowledged her outreach without providing any emotional fuel for further conversation. "Doing well, thanks for asking. Appreciate the thought, but I'm pretty swamped with work right now. Hope you're good too." Never rude, never angry, just consistently unavailable in a way that made it clear I wasn't interested in being her backup plan or emotional support system while she figured out her love triangle. My colleagues started noticing the change in my routine. I was staying later to help struggling students, volunteering for additional duties like chaperoning the debate team's weekend tournaments, actually using the school's fitness center instead of rushing home to text someone who might or might not respond. "You seem different lately," my department head mentioned during our weekly planning meeting. "More focused, I guess. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What I was doing was rediscovering what my life looked like when I wasn't constantly calculating someone else's mood or availability. I started attending evening fitness classes at a gym across town, partly to avoid any chance of running into Travis and his crew, but mostly because I wanted to try something completely outside my usual routine. The kickboxing instructor was this no-nonsense woman in her 40s who treated everyone like potential warriors, and there was something satisfying about hitting things legally and with proper form. On weekends, instead of waiting around hoping for plans that might get canceled last minute, I joined a local volunteer group that helped renovate community centers in underserved neighborhoods. Turned out there was something deeply therapeutic about tearing down old drywall and building something useful with your hands, especially when you were surrounded by people who showed up when they said they would and actually cared about making a difference. The work was physical, purposeful, and completely removed from the drama of who was texting whom and whether someone's ex-boyfriend was more appealing than their current relationship. 3 weeks into my new routine, I realized I hadn't checked Tessa's social media once that day, and when I tried to remember the last time I'd actively thought about her, I came up blank. Not because I was suppressing anything or forcing myself to move on, but because I was genuinely busy building a life that didn't revolve around managing someone else's emotional availability. The quiet satisfaction of that realization felt better than any dramatic confrontation or closure conversation ever could have. I was learning that sometimes the most powerful response to being treated as dispensable is to simply become completely self-sufficient, not as a strategy to make someone miss you, but as a way of remembering what you're actually worth when you're not constantly trying to prove it to someone who's already looking elsewhere. The volunteer work introduced me to an entirely different world of people who measured success by impact rather than Instagram likes. There was Miguel, a retired electrician who could rewire an entire building while telling stories that had everyone laughing, and Janet, a social worker who organized our weekend projects with military precision and genuine warmth. But it was Ruby who caught my attention, not because she was trying to, but because she was completely absorbed in teaching a group of kids how to properly use paint rollers without creating abstract art on their clothes. Ruby was a pediatric nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospital, spending her weekdays caring for sick children and her weekends helping renovate spaces where healthy kids could play and learn. She had this way of explaining things that made even the most complicated tasks seem manageable, whether she was showing a 10-year-old how to hold a paintbrush or walking me through the proper technique for installing baseboards. "The secret," she said, kneeling beside me as we worked on the community center's main room, "is to measure twice and cut once, but also to not take yourself so seriously that you can't laugh when you inevitably mess up anyway." Her laugh was genuine and frequent, bubbling up naturally when someone told a joke or when she managed to get more paint on herself than on the wall. Unlike the careful, curated interactions I'd grown accustomed to with Tessa, conversations with Ruby felt effortless and real. She asked thoughtful questions about my teaching, genuinely curious about how I made historical events relevant to teenagers who thought anything before social media was ancient history. "I bet you're the kind of teacher who makes kids actually want to learn," she said during a lunch break, sitting cross-legged on the grass outside the community center. "How do you do that?" I found myself explaining my philosophy about connecting past events to current issues, how I tried to help students understand that history wasn't just memorizing dates but recognizing patterns in human behavior that still matter today. Ruby listened intently, asking follow-up questions that showed she was actually absorbing what I was saying rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. "That's exactly what I try to do with scared kids in the hospital," she said. "Help them understand that what's happening to them isn't random or meaningless, that there's a process and a plan even when it's scary." Our friendship developed naturally over several months of weekend projects and group camping trips to Flagstaff, where Ruby proved to be surprisingly adventurous for someone who spent her weeks in sterile hospital environments. She was the first to volunteer for the more challenging hiking trails, always packed extra snacks for anyone who forgot to bring enough, and had this talent for making campfire coffee that actually tasted like something you'd want to drink rather than just caffeinated survival fuel. What struck me most about Ruby was her emotional availability, a concept I'd apparently forgotten existed. When she said she'd meet us at 8 in the morning, she was there at 7:50, coffee in hand and ready to work. When she asked about my day, she actually listened to the answer instead of scrolling through her phone or planning what she wanted to say next. When I mentioned feeling frustrated about a difficult student or a bureaucratic policy at school, she offered thoughtful perspective without trying to fix everything or change the subject to her own problems. By late fall, our group camping trips had evolved into just the two of us taking weekend adventures throughout Arizona, exploring slot canyons and hidden waterfalls that Ruby found through her network of outdoors and nurse friends. She introduced me to rock climbing at a local climbing gym, patiently teaching me proper technique while I tried not to embarrass myself too badly on the beginner routes. "The trick is trusting the equipment and your own strength," she said, belaying me on a particularly challenging route. "Stop overthinking every move and just go with what feels right." It was advice that seemed to apply to more than just climbing, and I found myself taking it to heart in ways that extended far beyond our weekend adventures. By spring, Ruby and I had transitioned from friendship to something deeper without any of the drama or uncertainty that had characterized my relationship with Tessa. There was no guessing about her feelings, no analyzing response times to texts, no wondering if she was comparing me to someone from her past. When Ruby said she enjoyed spending time with me, her actions consistently backed up her words. Our weekend trips expanded beyond Arizona as we explored California's national parks, with me documenting our adventures through photography, a hobby I'd picked up partly because Ruby encouraged my creative interests and partly because I wanted to capture the genuine happiness I was experiencing for the first time in months. The photos told the story of a relationship built on shared experiences rather than shared insecurities. Ruby laughing as she attempted to set up our tent in Joshua Tree, both of us covered in red dust after a challenging hike through Antelope Canyon, quiet moments watching sunsets from various mountain peaks throughout the Southwest. I started sharing some of these photos on social media, not to make any kind of statement, but because they represented experiences I was genuinely proud of and wanted to remember. The contrast with my previous relationship was stark. Instead of carefully curated posts designed to project an image, these were authentic moments that happened to look beautiful because we were actually enjoying ourselves. Meanwhile, according to our mutual friends who I occasionally ran into around town, Tessa's reunion with Travis was imploding in spectacular fashion. The personal trainer who had seemed so appealing during those parking lot conversations apparently had commitment issues that extended beyond just his previous relationship with Tessa. Within 2 months of their reunion, she discovered he was maintaining active profiles on multiple dating apps and had been seeing at least 2 other women throughout their exclusive reconciliation period. "She's pretty devastated," Sarah mentioned when I bumped into her at the grocery store. Travis turned out to be exactly the same guy he was before, just with better manipulation tactics. "She keeps saying she made a huge mistake." I felt a distant sympathy for Tessa's situation. Being deceived and disappointed is never fun, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. But mostly I felt grateful that her choice to pursue Travis had freed me up to discover what a healthy relationship actually looked like. Ruby never made me feel like I was competing with ghosts from her past or like I needed to prove my worth through grand gestures or constant availability. She appreciated my steady nature, my planning tendencies, and my terrible dad jokes about historical figures. When I suggested we take a long weekend trip to San Francisco, she was immediately excited about researching hiking trails in Marin County and finding the best local coffee shops, rather than focusing on how much the trip would cost or whether it would look impressive enough for social media. As I posted photos from our Golden Gate Bridge hike and our morning spent exploring Alcatraz, I noticed that Tessa had started liking every single post immediately after I shared it. Her name would appear in my notifications within minutes, sometimes followed by comments that seemed designed to insert herself into my new experiences. Under a photo of Ruby and me at Lombard Street, she commented, "Looks amazing. Remember when we talked about visiting SF together?" Under a sunset photo from our Sausalito dinner, she wrote, "Gorgeous view. You always had such a good eye for photography." The pattern was obvious and a little sad. She was monitoring my life from a distance, watching me build something real with someone else while her own attempt to recapture the past had fallen apart exactly as predictably as anyone could have foreseen. Through various mutual connections, I learned that Tessa had started asking detailed questions about Ruby and our relationship, fishing for information about our travel plans and how serious things were getting between us. When Dave mentioned at a coffee shop encounter that I was really happy with that nurse he's been seeing, Tessa apparently spent 20 minutes asking about Ruby's background, her job, and whether we seemed like we were planning a future together. The irony wasn't lost on me. The person who had been emotionally unavailable while we were together was now desperately available to monitor every detail of my life from the sidelines, watching me experience with someone else all the things she'd been too distracted to appreciate when they were offered to her. Tessa's online surveillance became increasingly obvious and desperate as Ruby and I planned a romantic vacation to celebrate our 6-month anniversary. I documented our weekend trips to the Grand Canyon, where Ruby had conquered her first technical rock climbing route, and our return to Sedona, where we'd camped under stars that were actually visible because we were focused on each other instead of checking our phones every few minutes. Each post generated the same immediate response from Tessa, instant likes followed by comments that grew progressively more personal and intrusive. When I shared a photo of Ruby rappelling down a cliff face with the caption, "Fearless," Tessa commented, "Wow, she's so adventurous. I always admired that about you too, how you pushed me to try new things." Under a sunset photo from our Sedona camping trip, she wrote, "That place holds such special memories, doesn't it? Remember our hike to Cathedral Rock?" The comments were carefully crafted to sound supportive while actually serving as public reminders of our shared history, little digital territorial markers designed to insert her presence into my new relationship. But it was our San Francisco vacation photos that really triggered her escalation. Ruby and I had spent 4 days exploring the city, from early morning runs across the Golden Gate Bridge to late dinners in North Beach, and I'd captured moments that genuinely reflected how comfortable and happy we were together. The photo of Ruby laughing at Pier 39 while sea lions barked in the background, the candid shot of her reading a book in Golden Gate Park, the selfie of us both covered in fog and grinning after hiking down from Twin Peaks, these weren't posed relationship advertisements, just documentation of a genuinely good time with someone who made everything more enjoyable. Tessa's response to these posts was immediate and increasingly unhinged. She liked every single photo within minutes of posting, commented on most of them with variations of "looks incredible," and "you two seem so happy," and then, according to Sarah, who reported this with barely concealed amusement, spent the next week asking everyone in our mutual friend group detailed questions about my relationship status. "Is it serious between them?" she asked Dave at their work happy hour. "Do they seem like they're talking about moving in together?" she pressed Sarah during a coffee meetup that Sarah had thought was just a casual catch-up. Has Cole mentioned anything about long-term plans? She asked Miguel when she ran into him at the farmer's market, apparently forgetting that Miguel barely knew her and would definitely report the conversation back to me the next weekend. The most telling incident came when Janet mentioned during one of our volunteer days that she'd received a friend request from someone named Tessa who claimed to be interested in joining our community renovation projects. She sent me this long message about wanting to give back to the community, Janet said, showing me the request on her phone. But when I looked at her profile, every single photo is from fancy restaurants and vacation spots. Doesn't exactly scream manual labor enthusiast to me. I recognized the profile photo immediately. It was from Tessa's trip to Cabo last year, where she'd spent more time photographing her drinks than actually relaxing. The idea of her showing up to scrape paint and install drywall in an attempt to infiltrate my social circle was both pathetic and oddly flattering. She was essentially conducting reconnaissance on my new life, trying to understand what I'd found with Ruby that had been missing in our relationship. When I shared this story with Ruby, she just laughed and shook her head. "That's actually kind of sad," she said, not with meanness but with genuine empathy. She must be really struggling to figure out why things fell apart. Ruby's response was perfectly characteristic. Instead of feeling threatened or territorial, she felt compassion for someone who was clearly lost and making poor decisions out of regret and confusion. It was exactly the kind of emotional maturity that made me realize how much growth was possible when you were with someone who approached relationships from a place of security rather than scarcity. The final straw came when Tessa somehow got my current phone number and sent a text suggesting we meet for coffee to properly catch up as friends and clear the air between us. The message was carefully worded to sound casual and mature, but the timing right after I'd posted about looking at apartments with Ruby made her motivation transparent. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet Tessa at a neutral coffee shop downtown, partly out of curiosity and partly because Ruby encouraged me to provide whatever closure Tessa seemed to need. "Sometimes people need to hear things directly," Ruby said when I showed her the text. "And you're kind enough to give her that, even after how things ended." The coffee shop meeting was exactly as awkward and predictable as I'd expected. Tessa arrived looking carefully put together but with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. She ordered a complicated drink with multiple modifications while I stuck with black coffee, and we found a corner table where she could have the emotional breakdown she'd apparently been planning. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, fidgeting with her cup. "About us, about the choices I made, about how badly I handled everything." I waited, knowing this conversation needed to run its course. Travis and I, that was a complete disaster. He turned out to be exactly the same person he'd always been, just better at hiding it temporarily. I realized I threw away something real for someone who was never going to change. The honesty was appreciated, even if it came 8 months too late. "I'm sorry that happened to you," I said, and I meant it. Being deceived isn't fun, regardless of the circumstances. "The thing is," she continued, tears starting to form, "I keep thinking about what we had, how stable and comfortable it was. How you always showed up when you said you would, how you actually listened when I talked, how you made me feel safe." Past tense. The irony of someone realizing they felt safe with you only after they'd voluntarily walked away from that safety wasn't lost on me. "That means something," I said carefully. "But you chose to leave that safety to chase something that felt more exciting." Her composure cracked completely when I pulled out my phone to show her photos of the engagement ring I'd been shopping for. Ruby and I had spent the previous weekend looking at rings together, and she'd fallen in love with a simple solitaire that suited her practical nature and active lifestyle. "This is what I'm planning to propose with," I said, showing Tessa the photo. "Probably next month, during a hot air balloon ride over the desert." The look on her face was devastating, pure realization that she'd lost something irreplaceable while chasing something that had been an illusion from the start. "Cole," she started, but couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm really happy for you," she finally managed, her voice breaking. "Ruby seems wonderful." "She is," I said simply. "She never made me feel like I was competing with someone from her past or like I needed to prove my worth every day. That's what a healthy relationship feels like." Tessa cried quietly for several minutes while I sat there feeling a mixture of sympathy and profound relief that I was no longer responsible for managing her emotions. Finally, I addressed the real reason for our meeting. "I need you to stop monitoring my social media and asking our friends about my life," I said gently but firmly. "The comments on my posts, the questions about Ruby, the attempt to join our volunteer group, it's not healthy for either of us." She looked genuinely surprised that I'd noticed the pattern. "I wasn't trying to interfere," she said weakly. I just wanted to understand. Understand what? How you moved on so completely. How you found something better so easily. The question revealed everything about how she'd viewed our relationship. It wasn't easy, and it's not better because it's different. It's better because it's with someone who actually wants to be there, I explained. Ruby didn't choose me because her other options fell through. She chose me because we built something good together. I paid for both our coffees and stood to leave. I genuinely hope you find what you're looking for, Tessa. But you need to stop looking for it in my past. 2 weeks later, I proposed to Ruby during sunrise in a hot air balloon floating over the Sonoran Desert, with the city of Phoenix spread out below us and the mountains painted gold by the early morning light. She said yes before I finished asking the question, laughing and crying simultaneously as I fumbled with the ring box while trying to maintain balance in the basket. The photos from that morning captured pure joy, Ruby's face glowing with happiness, both of us grinning like idiots against the backdrop of the Arizona landscape we'd explored together for months. When I posted the engagement announcement that evening, the responses were immediate and overwhelmingly positive from friends, family, and colleagues who'd watched our relationship develop naturally and healthily. Buried in the notifications, I noticed that Tessa had viewed the post but hadn't liked or commented, finally understanding that some choices create consequences that can't be undone, no matter how much regret follows.